Hi, I'm Sam Coffman. I'm director of the Human Path and Herbal Medics University, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Chaparral. Larrea species, Larrea tridentata is what's probably most commonly used. This is a sometimes called desert creosote bush, and you can tell why from the smell of the leaves. Anywhere that you find this plant, which is Arizona, New Mexico, all through West Texas, there's usually miles and miles of it. And it's got a smell that a lot of people do attribute to the smell of creosote, or think of it that way. It does have a kind of smell similar to that. It's not what it is, of course. This is an amazing medicinal plant, absolutely amazing medicinal plant. It is also arguably the oldest living plant in the world right now. The part of the plant that I use, is the leaf. And I like to harvest the leaf. You can harvest the leaf anytime, year-round. But I generally like to harvest it when it's very vibrant and green, and you find it that way like right now when the plant has just been into flower, just as it's coming into flower, or right after it's flowered. You find it a lot of times after really good rain even. For a few weeks it'll be that way. And you can harvest the leaf and the stem, the small stem as well, with the leaf, and I just eat with small stems. I'll just go ahead and harvest them together and make medicine out of everything. I don't take the time to just get the leaf necessarily separately. You don't need to. This is another one of those plants too that if you dry it correctly, it will last for a long time, a lot longer than most herbs will in the dried form. I've had Chaparral around for 3 or 4 years. It still is very potent. I don't like to keep anything around that long in the dried form without turning it into something that's going to last longer. But you can. The only thing I would say is if you do harvest it, just make sure that you're harvesting it, wildcrafting it correctly in terms of how you're storing it in the field. If you put this into a plastic bag, any kind of plastic, you're going to have moldy leaves within it within 24 hours. So very important that there's plenty of airflow. Pillowcase or whatever it is, burlap or whatever it might be that you're using for wildcrafting, it's got airflow, even paper. So the medicine of this plant is primarily, by most people, I think they use this, most herbalists use this plant in a 95% tincture, and that's just kind of the classic way. But I started years ago, I started doing a water decoction of it as well. And so what I'll do is I'll do a 95% tincture, and then take that marc, what's left over the marc, and I'll decoct that for about an hour on just a really low simmer, and then I'll strain that, and then I'll pour that back in with my alcohol tincture. So it's got a resting place of probably somewhere in the range of 40 to 60% alcohol, usually more like 60% alcohol. I don't necessarily do a 1-to-1. It's usually about 2/3 of the mix is usually the alcohol mix, and then about 1/3 is usually the water decoction. And after I started doing that, I found that my Chaparral was a lot more what I would say a broader spectrum and usable also in ways that I hadn't been using it before. But let me talk about how I do use it first to just kind of give you that context. I would say probably my original use of this plant it still remains the same, and that was for wound healing. It's an absolutely superlative, I would say, arguably one of the best plants that I know of in the world for wound healing. Because of its anti-infective type properties, antifungal, antibacterial type properties, as well as its ability as an anti-inflammatory, at least locally, and primarily its stimulation, in my opinion, also of lymph and of macrophage activity, and then its ability to move the tissue into a proliferative state and assist that and speed up the proliferation of tissue itself. I have on myself, and I don't necessarily recommend this, but without really a lot of care, but I have packed lacerations that were very deep, that needed a laceration that probably would have needed, probably the worst one I've done maybe would have been a 15 sutures or so, with just dried Chaparral powder, and then taped it together. And in less than 12 hours, seen that tissue just knit completely together, almost like a plastic surgeon had sutured it with all of the powder that the body wasn't using, scabbed out on the top of the wound. They could be just very carefully, with moisture, then pulled away, and then of course the wound taken care of from that point too. So you could literally use this to pack a wound, in my opinion. I've used it for burns the same way, for really bad burns with honey spread on them. It's classic. It grows in the sunlight, in direct sunlight. It grows in the most harsh kind of desert, high altitude type desert environments that there are, and yet it is such an amazing herb for UV and burn damage too. Another thing that I use this plant for, on that note, is as a bath for people who have suffered a lot of UV damage, and it can be everything from radiation therapy for cancer, and just dealing with that, all the way to just getting too much sun. Not even necessarily sunburn, although it goes well in a sunburn formula, but just a lot of sun, just way too much sun. People that are dehydrated. The irony is that energetically, this plant seems to be very drying and very cold. Well, the irony wouldn't be cold, but the drying aspect of it. You can use it even for people who have been exposed to that and who you would think their tissues are really dry, and yet it doesn't seem to dry things out. It doesn't, that when you pack a wound with it, it doesn't dry the wound out at all either. Or when you use it in a wound as a poultice and let it drip into the wound, it doesn't dry the wound out. But it is a drying herb. It's usually considered energetically a drying herb. But it's definitely not a moistening herb really either. It's just a very interesting plant. I use it internally with care. It's important to dose this usually in a formula rather than by itself, although I do use it by itself too. Let me explain how, when, and where I do that. First of all, I think it is, again, one of the most superlative, maybe in the world, or certainly in the North America, plants for working with any herpes family virus. This would be HSV1, HSV2, chickenpox if you want to, if you want to use something. Certainly shingles, absolutely. Probably cytomegalovirus. To some extent, I use mostly in formulas there, but just by itself, I've used it in these other conditions in particular, and externally and internally in low dosages, that I'll talk about the dosage in a second here, and had just amazing results. Even if all you did was use it externally, and you don't even have to necessarily make a salve out of it, although it does make an amazing salve. You can certainly put it in an oil salve and infuse it into oil. Let me talk about that in a minute, but first, know that you can actually take the tincture itself that I just described, the bi extract that I talked about, doing a water as well as an alcohol extract, and you can put that directly on things like shingle sores, for instance, and just watch them go away within hours. And taking it internally, it's usually more of a drop-wise dosage. I mean, I would say you should never probably take more than maybe 5 milliliters of this a day. That's the absolute max. That's for a large adult size. So normally we're talking somewhere between 5 and 15 drops in a dosage that you're maybe doing 3 or 4 times a day. So it's really a small dosage type plant. It definitely has liver toxicity to it, so you have to watch that. It can people a lot of times will know when they're just not they shouldn't be taking it. If they're fairly aware of their body, they will just, they won't want to take it anymore. It can cause people to kind of get hot, kind of flushed faces, feel like blood rushing to their head. I've had that happen. People to feel nauseous, to just feel like, the taste goes from, of course the taste is pretty strong in the first place, and a lot of people that hate the taste, and I think Michael Moore used to say, I'm totally paraphrasing this, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think he used to say something like, if you like the taste of Chaparral, then you need an herb for psychological damage because there's something wrong with you. But basically, the taste is extremely strong and very intense. But some people actually like the taste. And like most herbs, I feel like people that are, if you're attracted to an herb and you're attracted to the herb's taste, in many ways, for reasons that we don't understand, your body is probably needs that herb. And the same thing will happen though. I've seen people that are they're like, oh wow, I like this. This actually feels really good. I like this taste. And then 2 days later, it'll be like, that just makes me sick. I can't even take it anymore. And I think that it has this kind of regulating component to it somehow if a person's listening to their own body. What it does as an antiviral for the herpes virus is pretty profound, and so it'll stop shedding of the virus, and it's a very effective herb. What I usually do in terms of those viruses I just talked about, the herpes family viruses, is I'll do about a 75% chaparral and about a 25% tanacetum, a feverfew. And the parthenolides in the feverfew are also very strongly anti-herpes family virus, and they work together really well. It helps with the shingles pain as well. Tanacetum, of course, helps with that a lot, and it's very effective. Same thing's true with HSV2 sores or HSV1 sores on the mouth or wherever it may be. You're going to find that same type of an effect. So that is probably clinically the most common use for me. But I use it in a lot of formulas, everything from antifungal formulas for like gut candidiasis, where we've got to really pull that down. It's a very profoundly intense antifungal. Topically as well, you can use it that way. And I use it a lot in any kind of just like broad spectrum kind of anti-infective formulas. So just kind of shotgun formulas. We're trying to get something maybe in the gut. We don't know if it's even bacterial or if it's protozoan or if it's viral, gastroenteritis, but we're just trying to deal with something, a lot of times in a different country, and it might have been from bad water, we don't know. This would be a great one to throw in there too. It's one of the few herbs that I carry as a simple in my first aid kits. My first aid kits are usually formula based, just because it's a lot easier to work with formulas, and if you're carrying something in a pack, you can't have 100 different simples, right? So I usually use mostly formulas. There's 3 herbs that I usually carry as a simple. One of them is Echinacea, a mix of the purpurea and angustifolia. One is Larrea, is Chaparral, and one is Algarita, which is our Berberis trifoliolata. And those 3 mixed together, actually, ironically, make an incredibly good broad spectrum kind of anti-infective. So Echinacea, angustifolia, I mix the purpurea tops and the angustifolia roots. So Echinacea mix, Chaparral, and Algarita or Berberis, or a barberry. You could probably even use arguably Oregon grape, although I don't think it's nearly as strong as Algarita. Those 3 mixed together, pretty profound antibacterial or anti-infective type of formula. You could use this externally on MRSA infections. You can use it. Internally for infections, especially for gut infections. You're going to find that Chaparral is one of those herbs that's just it's a medium to high toxicity, so it has a very strong and potent effect usually. But you have to be aware of that toxicity too. So I always I gave you the dosage earlier, but I would say I would recommend never taking Chaparral more than maybe 2 weeks at a time without taking a break of at least that long, if not double. And you should never probably have to take it longer than that. Honestly, anytime I've used it for acute infections or acute conditions, it's in 5 days or 6 days, the problem is either gone or we're using the wrong herbs. But most of the time, the vast majority of the time, the problem goes away if it's an infection-related type problem. So we talked about it as its effects on the radiation, the cooling, as well. And it's very good for that externally. And just somebody's been out all day to just take this and put it into make a Chaparral tea, just an infusion tea out of even a fresh leaf will work this way, and then strain it and just pour it over themselves. It's just kind of an outdoor bath. It really helps. It really rejuvenates the body from getting too much sun. It's quite impressive the way that happens. Many other uses for this. Everything I've used it for things like venom as well. Used it for brown recluse bites on the surface of the skin, and it's incredible. The only problem is people that use it a lot that are sensitive to it will have the same effect I talked about when they're taking it internally. There's a point where people just say I can't take it anymore, not even on my skin, on this ulcerated bite. Venomous bite, probably. I've never used it on any kind of snake venom, but I am really sure. It would be one I would turn to if I didn't have some of the other herbs, or even if I did, I certainly would turn to it and try it. I think it's one of those herbs that in the Chinese parlance they might say it clears toxic heat. So that toxicity, the toxic part of that infection, I think is where we see it working really well. The last thing I want to say about it in medicine making, I mentioned earlier, it makes a great oil. A lot of the constituents in here come out really well in alcohol. So this is one of the herbs that I would say I would recommend if you know how to make an alcohol sap to do it that way. So you take your either isopropyl or grain alcohol, but it's 99% isopropyl or 95% grain alcohol, and you give it about a 20-minute bath in that, and then you're going to go ahead and mix that your final solvent off of that in with your oil and your herb, and you're going to heat it and blend it first really good, and then heat it, and you're going to burn off all of that alcohol. You're going to evaporate off all of that alcohol, and you get a stronger, a better salve out of that, in my opinion, than you do just off of a pure, just putting it into oil and infusing the oil, which is kind of the common way most people make oils. And that's, I guess, what I have to say about Larrea for today.